have the opportunity to have dialogues like this. We need to have the kind of thinking that humanists bring to bear on major social issues as a part of our cultural discourse. The humanities teaches things that benefit the entire university. We make scientists better scientists, social scientists better social scientists. We make engineers better engineers. What happens in the humanities helps people think critically, learn to communicate. It helps people engage across boundaries, intellectual boundaries, cultural boundaries, disciplinary boundaries. So the work that's being done in the humanities is really important to the entire university, and it's really important to our culture. We're at a point in the culture, I was talking with some folks earlier this evening, we're at a point in our culture where we've almost lost the capacity to talk with each other in meaningful ways. People are so entrenched in their positions, it's difficult for them to even hear each other. And Dean Tyler Stovall, the Dean of the Humanities, who's here with us tonight, just said to me the most beautiful thing. He said that he was told by a teacher when he was young that hearing was a sense, but listening was an art. Isn't that beautiful? And so a part of what I feel like we can do in the humanities is really bring to the fore these important, culturally critical questions. And I'm so delighted that all of you are here to be a part of that conversation. I'm really proud to be here at UC Santa Cruz. I've been here now, I'm coming up on 8 months. 8 months in the beautiful city of Santa Cruz, the most beautiful city in the country. I run every day on West Cliff Drive in the morning before the sun comes up. It's just such an incredibly glorious place to live. And in the top university system in the world. The top university system in the world. We have some of the most extraordinary faculty in the world. A lot of people don't know that our faculty is the 3rd most cited faculty in the entire world. Isn't that amazing? And you're going to get to have 3 of them on the stage for you here tonight. Now, what's really exciting about what's going on with what used to be called the Institute for Humanities Research and has now been redubbed the Humanities Institute, is that what they're doing is they're engaging with our amazing faculty and researchers, our amazing students, and they're connecting with you because you're a part of that important conversation. And I'm so excited to have these incredible faculty here with you tonight to talk with you. Before I bring up Nathaniel Deutsch, who is the director of the Humanities Institute, the director of the Center of Jewish Studies, and the moderator for the evening, I want to congratulate him, managing director Irena Polak, and their team on a successful rebranding of the Institute. So we say farewell to the Institute for Humanities Research and hello to the Humanities Institute at UC Santa Cruz. Can you please give them a round of applause? If you haven't checked out their website, please do so. There are a host of initiatives you should take a look at. It's packed with public events. It's a hub for research, cross-disciplinary collaboration, public engagement, and it's also just a beautiful site. There are very few humanities groups in higher ed that can match the track record of the Humanities Institute in terms of incubating and supporting research for faculty, graduate students, and undergrads, and in bringing humanities events to the public through partnership and events like this one. And they've been at it for nearly 2 decades. So congratulations to the Institute. Thank you all for being here tonight, and will you please welcome our esteemed guests.
Thank you, Marlene. Can everybody hear me? Yes. So I think after Marlene's remarks, you all know why we're so excited to have her as our new EVC, and it's wonderful that you could be here and to introduce this event. As Marlene mentioned, this is the first Questions That Matter that we're having as the Humanities Institute. Until now, we have been called the Institute for Humanities Research. We're still doing research, so don't worry about that. I know that you were wondering. But in the last few years, we've also increased our public outreach. And we think that, especially in times like this, it's so important that we break down the often invisible, but still sometimes felt walls between the campus and the community. And we really take seriously the fact that we are a public university. We are your university. I know many of you are alum. But more broadly, we really belong and see ourselves as performing in a crucial mission for the people of the state of California and beyond. And so the Humanities Institute reflects that public mission in its name. Another way in which this fourth Questions That Matter that we're doing is different is that this year we received a $1.5 million grant from the Mellon Foundation and I know he's here today. Tyrus Miller, who's the Dean of Graduate Studies, is the principal investigator on the grant. And the grant is to focus on graduate student education and also public humanities. And starting this year, our Questions That Matter topic, in this case freedom and race, is going to anchor a series of public events devoted to that topic. So we'll have, for example, in March, another event on Japanese American internment during World War II that I want to invite everybody to. And we'll have other events as well. Next year, futures will be the theme of Questions That Matter. We also have courses around the topic of freedom and race that are going to be offered in 3 of the colleges at the university to undergraduates. And we have 3 graduate student instructors who are being mentored by faculty, including by Jennifer, who will be offering those. So we're really trying to put all of these pieces together to focus on topics that we think are of incredible importance to everyone right now. I want to thank a number of people and then give you a sense of what the structure of tonight's events will be. First of all, Irina Polic, who's the managing director of the Humanities Institute. And if you have any questions after the event, please feel free to come up to her and ask. Evan Knight, Jessica Guild are both staff members of the Humanities Institute that did amazing work to get this where we are. I also want to thank the people at Swell Creative Group, and especially Adam Jacobson and Philip Holmes, who are UCSC alum, who helped us to rename, rebrand, create a new website, and it was wonderful to collaborate with them. They're also here, so thank you to Adam and Philip. And I also want to thank Dean Stovall for his leadership of the Humanities Division in so many ways, making all of this possible, and then the people at Kuumbwa and all the tech people. So the format tonight, I'm going to introduce our 2 faculty members, and then I'm going to frame the conversation with a few remarks. Then we'll have a conversation together, and then I'll open it up to all of you to have questions and answers. So first, we have Jennifer González, who's a professor. And I'm so excited that both Jennifer and Tyler are participating in this. He's a professor of history of art and visual culture at UC Santa Cruz and teaches in the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program in New York City. She has received fellowships from the Ford Foundation, the American Association of University Women, and the American Council of Learned Societies. She writes about the visual arts, race, activist art, digital culture, and feminism in books such as Subject to Display, Reframing Race in Contemporary Installation Art, and in anthologies such as Race in Cyberspace, with Other Eyes, looking at race and gender in visual culture, and the forthcoming Chicana and Chicano Art, a critical anthology. She is a frequent lecturer at universities, art schools, and art museums, such as the LA County Museum of Art, San Francisco MoMA, Smithsonian, Musée du Quai Branly, Paris, the Whitney Museum, and the Guggenheim, New York. So thank you, Jennifer, for participating tonight. And we also have Tyler Stovall, who, as I mentioned, is the Dean of the Humanities Division. He's also a Distinguished Professor of History at UC Santa Cruz. and is currently serving as president of the American Historical Association, which is really extraordinary that he's doing all of this at once. He specializes in the history of modern France, in particular the study of labor, urban history, social history, race, and post-colonialism. Professor Stovall has written and edited several books on the subject, including The Rise of the Paris Red Belt, Paris Noir, African Americans in the City of Light, The Color of Liberty, Histories of Race in France, which was co-edited with Sue Peabody, and Transnational France, The Modern History of a Universal Nation. He is currently working on a global history of the relationship between freedom and race, tentatively entitled White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea, which is forthcoming by Princeton University Press. So welcome, Tyler. So in preparing for this event, I debated how to begin and how to frame it. And what I decided to do was read very briefly from a few historical documents. I'm also a historian. So the first set of documents that I want to read from are a series of laws that were passed in the 1930s in Nazi Germany. And actually, I'm sorry to say, these are some of the what's the right word? I mean, they're all horrible, but the least horrible of some of the laws that were passed. But I choose these for a specific reason. This was passed by the City Council of Augsburg in 1935. Entrance of Jews to public bathing and swimming facilities is forbidden. Marriage between Jews and citizens of German or related blood is forbidden. Such marriages that have already taken place are void. Extramarital intercourse between Jews and citizens of German or related blood are forbidden. Jews are not permitted to use public libraries. Now, why did I start with Nazi Germany? All of us would expect that Nazi Germany would have laws like this, but many of us, including, I would include myself in this, would not know that the origin of many of these laws, the inspiration was actually Jim Crow in the United States. And there's a recent book that's been published, an important book that looks carefully at that. Now, why do I make that connection? Because Jim Crow, of course, as we all know, were laws that were passed in states in the United States, the same country where the Declaration of Independence comes from. And I want to read now from the Declaration of Independence, the most famous second line of the Declaration. Ratified on July 4th, 1976.
17.
Look at this. We have so many. We have some historians in the crowd. Thank you. Thank you. I was testing you. That's what I do with my students. It's good. It's good. When my remarks are done, you can say, if they say something wrong, you do it. All right. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, we all know that slavery existed, that the chief person who wrote these lines, Thomas Jefferson, was a slave owner himself, right? And so here we have, in the case of the United States, the tension between, on the one hand, freedom, this articulation of such a powerful articulation of freedom, and profound racism from the very beginning. I want to read one more line from another document, another founding document. This one is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen from August 26, 1789, by the French National Assembly. And Thomas Jefferson also had a hand in this document. Article 1, all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. When this was written, France controlled Saint-Domingue, the most profitable, exploitative slave colony, probably Tyler was mentioning, in the history of the world, certainly at the time, and would oppose, even though the French Revolution inspired the slaves in Saint-Domingue to fight for their freedom, France opposed it. And eventually, as we also know, they would be victorious and create Haiti in 1804. So here we have these two beacons of freedom imbricated with racism from the very, very beginning. And so I want to frame this conversation by pointing out this tension, even paradox. And so my first question is to both of you. There are many different definitions of freedom. What do you think are most relevant for framing our conversation on freedom and race? And do you want to go first, Jennifer?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nathaniel. That's a wonderful beginning. When he proposed some of these questions, I thought, one can talk for a really long time about any of these questions. And your setup is perfect. We didn't talk about this before, but I will be talking a little bit about law and the Constitution and this tension for one of your other questions. But I think when we first think of freedom and race, we typically think of unfreedom as sort of where we go in the United States. We begin to think about, doesn't race implicate some sense of unfreedom? But if you think about democracy in the Greek form, a free person was always defined against that person who was not free. And Wendy Brown writes about this, that freedom is always a condition of relation, that there's always someone that is unfree. In this case, it would have been a woman or a slave in this instance. And then after we have that sort of first notion of democracy and freedom, we move to later on in a more Cartesian mode in the 18th century. We have a kind of shift in this notion of freedom in relation to a notion of freedom as autonomy, the idea that we have that to be free is to be monadic, alone, independent, and individual. And what I see also as a tension then in the United States and French declarations of liberty and independence is precisely this kind of tension between freedom in relation to oppression and freedom as a declaration of autonomy. And I think that that is a really interesting way to then think about how specific kind of racialized bodies play out. So when I think about freedom and race in the US context in particular, I think about implications like emancipation, liberation, these notions of freedom. But they also always imply incarceration, constraint. And so I think that this will be kind of where our conversation will go.
Tyler?
Well, I had a couple of ideas in response to this question. First of all, I decided to come up with a few very brief statements that I hope will lead us in the direction of how do we associate these two ideas. The first is simply freedom is not slavery. Okay. The second draws upon a historical evolution which says that freedom is not black slavery. Okay. The third is, of course, then freedom is not blacks. And the fourth is then freedom is whites. Okay? So if you go down that list, which is, of course, a deeply historical list, I think you come to a place where you see how these ideas can be associated. One of the things I've tried to argue in my work, and you sort of ended up your introductory remarks by talking about this paradox. I've tried to argue that in some ways this is not a paradox at all. That in some ways the two ideas go very much together. So if you look at the history of the American Revolution, for example, many Southerners who were most enamored of the freedom narrative argued precisely that it was their slaves that enabled them to be free. Okay, that without the freedom from labor provided by their slaves, and of course you can talk about all sorts of gendered versions of this as well, they could not be free men. Okay. The other thing I wanted to, and this sort of leads into my other point, which is the relationship between the idea of freedom and the idea of property. Or as Janis Joplin once said, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. Okay. Or as the bumper sticker says, I owe, so off to work I go. There is a sense in which freedom is related to a kind of consumer culture that, on one sense, freedom from possessions is the ability to live without possessions is a kind of freedom, but in a much more profound sense, you can only have freedom if you have the material wherewithal to have power, to have a place in society. And one of the points about the relationship between freedom and slavery in the modern era is that, of course, slavery is property. Slaves are property. They're the people having that property that allows you to be free. And that was one of the justifications for slavery.
Yeah.
So, Tyler, in our conversations leading up to this event, you mentioned a famous saying by Isaiah Berlin, and some of you may have heard this. Freedom for the wolves has often meant death to the sheep. Could you explain why you think that this is relevant for our conversation tonight?
Okay. No, this was something I thought about a lot, because it seems to me freedom is in the eye of the beholder. That, and one of the things modern societies have had to reckon with is that there is no such thing as absolute freedom. That you do not have the right to do certain things. That your freedom ends at the place where it affects other people negatively. Now, of course, that is a matter of great interpretation. And it really is a matter of individual interpretation. But all modern societies have had to make this kind of compromise between total unlimited freedom, or as the anarchist light bulb joke goes, how many anarchists does it take to change a light bulb? All of them. Versus the ability of a society to survive and to protect the weak as well as to empower the strong. It is an unresolved tension certainly in American society, and I think most global societies. And where it enters into our particular conversation is when issues of power are often defined in racial terms. Either literally, as in the case of the first series of Nazi German laws you read, or in many other kinds of ways. So that one may enjoy the freedom to live in a neighborhood of one's own choosing, but you can only do that by excluding other people from living in that neighborhood.
Jennifer, and I should mention that one of the pleasures for me in these events is that we all meet. We've been meeting for a year,
Yeah.
and having this
long.
conversation, and so it's a process that's been happening, and hopefully will be ongoing, for a number of us. So Jennifer, you mentioned when we were having an earlier conversation the historic encounter between the Spanish conquistadors and indigenous peoples in Mexico as raising crucially important issues for our understanding of the relationship between freedom and race. What did you have in mind?
Not just Mexico, but,
Yeah.
but the New World. Well, the term race enters the English language in the 16th century, about 1540, and etymologists believe, and they've studied this, that it comes from the Portuguese and the Spanish term raza, a term that becomes more and more commonly used also in the 16th century. In 1560, for example, it's used to describe certain groups of peoples in the Americas. If we think about the way the Americas have inherited a certain kind of fascination with blood purity, which really drove the Spanish in their attacks on the Moors and the Jews after they worked to expulse the Moors from power, and they engaged with the Spanish Inquisition to shape this condition in Spain, we begin to understand how that affects the long-term thinking about bodies in the New World. So the Inquisition, as we know, was probably one of the early forms of a kind of aggression toward non-believers, and nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. I had to do that. But so what happens then is that these notions about who can own property, who can be able to practice a certain religion, who must be converted, is inculcated in culture and moves across the Atlantic with the conquistadors, who, incidentally, are only pure line blood Spaniards. If you were Moorish or you were Jewish, you were not allowed to go to the New World, which is a really fascinating kind of prohibition, probably in terms of property. So I think when we then look at New Spain or at this period of the 16th century, 17th century in the Americas, we begin to see how racial hierarchies are constructed. Lots of intermarrying and intermixing of ethnicities and races was happening at this time, but it was within an incredibly rigid hierarchy and notions of blood and lineage, such that a system called the casta system or caste system was instituted, sometimes producing more than 30 different permutations or descriptions of racial types So terms that we have heard today, or we hear today, like the mestizaje, mestizo, the mulatto, terms like these emerged under contexts of racialized mapping. And then this casta system evolved even more in the 17th century through an image culture. So painting started to evolve, and now you have a production in the 17th century and 18th century of paintings called casta paintings, where the very earliest signs of a kind of racial taxonomy are created. Remember, this is the period when museums are creating taxonomies for animals, vegetables, and minerals, and trying to catalog and put things in boxes. People needed to be put in boxes too. And so these paintings are these really interesting grids. And in the grid, you have like a Spaniard married to an Indian, and then they produce this kind of child. Whereas if you have an Indian married to an African, it produces this kind of child. And this whole taxonomy of difference and hierarchy is also inframed, coming back to the question of property, around class. Because the grid on the upper left is the two Spaniards who have the highest class. And then you move your way all the way down. And in this painting, you have two light-skinned Spaniards well-dressed in a well-appointed home. And then in the lower right, you have, an Indio marrying an African, and that's kind of producing this mixed race coyote. And the clothes are ragged, and everyone is sort of being a drunkard. And so all of these notions of a kind of character transformation, class transformation, and the racialized mapping of body color and body type starts really early. And we inherit that in the Americas. So in the US, it's not the case that all those ideas of race are coming from declarations and slavery only. They're also coming from this tradition.
Now, both of you have to some extent responded to this, but I want to give you the opportunity to elaborate. Could you both discuss the racialization of freedom that has taken place in different contexts historically, for example, in slavery, property, immigration, voting, and labor? So it's an open-ended question.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a rather broad question, but let me take a stab at it. I think one of the things that is important to look at is how the idea of race is, of course, a floating signifier. It is not a fixed category. It is, as you used the term relational earlier, and it is very much that. So, for example, my main specialty of history is France. There was, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, but the French had long had this idea that France was a nation of free men. So much so that there were slaves who were brought to the French metropole in the 18th century who petitioned for freedom and won it because they said they were coming to free soil. And France, as the saying goes, and this is the title of the book by Sue Peabody, there are no slaves in France. But if you look at the discourse that came through these legal records, what you found was the aristocratic courts that set them free were embracing the idea of both that there should be no slaves in France, but also that there should be no blacks in France. And it tended to shift from one to the other and tended to shift more towards the other direction by the end. Or to take another example, my family's home state of West Virginia was formed, of course, in revolt against the Southern secession during the Civil War. But part of this secession was, part of its secession from the secession was based not just on anti-slavery, but on the opposition of blacks in West Virginia, the opposition to blacks in West Virginia. So they did not want slaves because they did not want blacks. So those are two examples. But I think also if you look at the ways in which race has often been a kind of stalking horse for other ideas, like labor, like gender, for example, like different kinds of difference. It is often both, at least in my experience, both in French and in American history, played that role. And often in popular culture as well. I mean, I remember once speaking to a French friend who'd gone to Quebec and was walking down the street, no, I think it was Montreal, walking down the street and started speaking French to people. And the response was, speak white, right? So it stands in as a sort of stand-in for many different kinds of differentiation mechanisms, I think.
Could you talk about the relationship to labor? I mean, you've written on labor in Paris and elsewhere. How does that interact with it?
During the 19th century, for example, the slave metaphor was very popular as a metaphor for oppression, class oppression of all kinds. In fact, it goes beyond that. The second verse of the Marseillaise has an explicit reference to being treated as slaves by the royal government. And so you have this incredibly powerful metaphor of working people as slaves that, to a certain extent, also coexists with the rise of empire in France in the late 19th century. And so empire was in a place where, in effect, you could sort of stop being a slave by leaving the metropole and going to a colonial realm, especially in Algeria, which was largely, the French population was largely working-class Frenchmen and women who were able to move to the colonies, buy what were in effect plantations, employ cheap Arab labor, and in effect, in a rhetorical sense, go from being slaves to slave owners. So, so it's a very, very unstable kind of signifier. But I think the emphasis on sort of relationships between race and class are really complex, but also virtually impossible to escape. You talk about, for example, the experience of Nazi Germany. You know, there you also have a sense where you had what was in many cases seen as a working class, a Jewish population that was both racially other, and also when you look at the Jewish population of Poland, working class as well. And the two categories sort of slid together more often than not.
Jennifer?
That is such a big question.
Yeah. I could give you a more specific one too. If you
No, it's okay. So I just decided I would just take part of that question and think about law, because we know that race is an invented idea, that it's not a property that actually belongs to a person. It is just a relation between people. The law is similarly just a relation between people that we more or less agree to, whether we like it or not. So I was really interested in thinking about how law in the US, just to take a small sample, and just a small sample of laws, invite us to think about how the relation that we call race is embedded structurally in our history. So this comes back to Nathaniel's point at the very beginning about, for example, Article 1 of the Constitution, and many of you know this, includes 3 subjects. It includes free people, it includes Indians, and it includes others. Those are the words that are used. And we can surmise that the others are slaves. They're worth 3/5 because that's how they can be taxed. So Article 1 about taxation already structures a racial hierarchy at the very beginning of the Constitution. And then later on in the Emancipation Proclamation, for example, which is about freeing slaves, it's not really a law, but it's basically a law being written into law by Lincoln, talks about who gets to be free. And many of us don't know this because we don't bother to read very far in, but if you read the entire Emancipation Proclamation, the whole second half is about except here and except there and except in this other place, not in these other places. So it's a really interesting document that says, I'm freeing these slaves more or less so they can fight on the Union side in the war, but all these other folks aren't included in my emancipation. So I'm intrigued by how these laws then proliferate to shape other ways of thinking about bodies. For example, then you come to the US Census. The census is more or less invented in the 18th century and into the 19th century as the #1 bureaucratic framework for thinking about race, and categories are constructed that then our bodies are required to fit into. This is a really critical device that we still use today, the census. So the law of the census in 1870 was confused because it didn't know what to do with the Chinese. Should the Chinese be categorized by race, or should the Chinese be categorized by nation? They decided to categorize the Chinese by race. Why? Because there were laws already on the books that reduced the Chinese rights to property, reduced the Chinese rights to disputes with whites, that were on the books for Indians and slaves and Africans and Mexicans. So they decided it was better to think of the Chinese as a race. And before that, there was all this interesting debate. And then you know the rest, which is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which lasts all the way until 1943. So, right? Now we're up to the 40s. I'm just leaping. A lot of people don't know this either. Many people think about desegregation of schools as Brown versus Board of Education, 1964. But actually, California was the first place that had a desegregation law. In 1957, Mendez versus Westminster School in Orange County won a dispute for segregating Mexicans. And my father went to a segregated school when he was a child. A lot of people don't know this about the California school system, that there were Mexican schools for the Mexicans. So these laws are sort of how we get up to the present, Prop 187. What I'd like to suggest is that for a long time, California history is really sad. But anyway, for a long time in this state, we can't be too smug about it and say, oh, those Southerners. In this state, in 1851, $500,000 was given to people to assassinate Indians by the state. So if you're interested in real racial history in California, you need to look at these other less visible examples and to think about how the law figures in constructing a place for all of us.
All right, well.
Kind of dark.
This is what happened when you talk about freedom and race. But you brought us up to the present.
Right.
And so the next question I want to ask is about a current moment, where in the next few questions are about the current moment. And obviously we're at a fraught time. And who knows what's happening right now while we're doing this. You can't check your phones right now. So anything, all bets are off. All bets are off. So this question it goes like this. Universities, internet sites have recently become battlegrounds between advocates of free speech and activists who believe that certain types of expression, including racist and other forms of hate speech, should be prohibited. What are your thoughts on this?
Is that a yes/no question?
Well, it's up to you. I know.
Yes.
Well, let me first make the point that I think that conflict in and of itself, or the way in which that conflict is posed, in and of itself often hides certain things. Because if you allow the sort of extreme right to assume the mantle of free speech, first of all, it's not only a problematic political decision, it's also not grounded in reality at all. You can think of lots of examples where the same kind of people that support Milo Yiannopoulos have been among the first to demand the suppression of views that they don't like. So let me just start off with that point, okay? But I think it's also important to note that there are lots of different ways of fighting battles. And if you're talking about trying to get people to understand why certain speech acts are so hurtful or so hateful, cutting off debate is not the way to do it. It is important to engage with people and at least give them the respect to think that they can understand where you're coming from, because they should have the respect for you to understand the same thing. I remember once teaching a course at Santa Cruz many years ago where one of my students was a member of the Young Americans for Freedom and proudly had a bumper sticker for the Young Americans for Freedom on his notebook, which he carried to school every day. And it was actually great having him in class because he was in class, because he had this bumper sticker, students had to deal with him. And they couldn't just sort of assume that everybody agreed with everybody else and everybody believed the same thing. So, it was actually a valuable learning experience for all of us, I hope for him, but certainly for his classmates as well. When I was a professor at Berkeley, I organized an open public event on activism and the university. And one of the groups I invited was the Berkeley College Republicans. This was shortly after they'd done what was called the Affirmative Action Bake Sale, where you paid for goods according to what race you were, right? A very, very heinous act. And yet it seemed to me if you're not dealing with them, you were not really dealing with student activism at that university. So,
I should mention, by the way, that Tyler used to teach at UC Santa Cruz, went to UC Berkeley. He compared both of them, then he decided to come back to UC Santa Cruz. just to make sense of the genealogy he had here.
Yeah.
Jennifer, did you want to?
Yes. It's the difficult question. And I think, to be provocative, I'd like to suggest that there's that some forms of white supremacy should be framed as terrorism. And only one person. Look, if you have a condition of law where you have a group that's trying to incite to violence, that we have a definition of terrorism in the State Department, which is the unlawful incitement to violence toward a group or a nation based on a political or other sets of desires. And I would suggest that we need to start looking at forms of white supremacy as terrorism and applying the same kinds of laws to the ways that certain hate groups operate. And that's useful. And the reason why it's useful is because there's obviously a spectrum. There's a spectrum of people who are interested in terrorism in the fundamental Islamic communities. There are people who are interested in terrorism in the white supremacy communities. There are people who are interested in terrorism in other communities. And law enforcement is supposed to attend to these. They need to attend to them on the internet. They need to actually look out for those folks. They need to watch them. And so what I'm suggesting is that as long as we're having a critical debate, as long as people are using words, as long as there's an effort to try to engage in listening and talking, I'm for it. I don't think it works to necessarily say you can't talk about the issues you want to talk about. But as soon as you're going to incite to violence, as soon as you're going to promote any kind of repression of others, as soon as you're going to actually pose threats, as some groups do, then it's time to shut down and engage. So I'm actually thinking, why is it that we have such a double standard in this country, right? You know, if a black group was trying to do the same thing that some of these white supremacist groups are doing in terms of marching and throwing, putting various kinds of violence onto other groups, we'd have some serious problems. So I'm just saying, let's open our minds and think about how we can include white supremacy under terrorism. And think about how that operates, on a day-to-day basis, but not shut down speech, not shut down debate, not shut down the opportunity to engage.
I think the challenge is always when it comes to speech is well, in the way you framed it, where would protected speech end and terrorism begin as speech?
And this is what the FBI thinks about all the time.
Right.
But we don't necessarily trust them. I don't know. But I guess what I'm saying is you're in law enforcement, and you have to figure out at what point did this person's email to that other person in that fundamentalist group indicate that something is going to happen, right? That's the question. But then you're asking a bigger question, which is what kinds of things should we not enunciate? Is it possible that the very enunciation of an idea is an incitement to violence? And this is, I think,
and also, are there
question.
certain spaces, and specifically, let's say the university, where there should there be less freedom or more freedom because it's the university to articulate ideas that and to have conversations that have
Right.
these things included in them.
I'm
And
always
just
in
to
favor of
follow up
more.
on that, what does it mean when, following our discussion, the very notion of freedom is implicated in racial formations, in racial discrimination and racial categories? Okay.
All right, well, I think this question follows up on that, and you can maybe add. So one of the ways that freedom and race come together most powerfully are in images, statues, and so on, including in the recent controversy over the removal of Civil War monuments in cities around the country. Of course, Charlottesville, Virginia, is the most infamous case of that. So Jennifer, as an art historian and as a theorist, what is your take on these current debates? And more generally, what do you think the underlying issues are that make this so powerful and contentious?
Such a good question. So I'm interested in visual culture, and taking that earlier example of the Costa painting, trying to think about how race is a highly visual discourse. It's a highly visual form. That is, bodies are mapped according to skin color, they're mapped according to phenotype. Throughout the 19th century, this becomes taxonomized. It goes into eugenics, and we know the history of a kind of visual mapping of racial typology continues well into the 20th century. And as a thinker, I'm trying to understand how it is that visual culture factors in the perpetuation of race and racial stereotypes and racism. And so this affects a lot of the different kinds of work that I do. And coming back to this question about the icon, if we live in a culture where the soundbite is a kind of device that interrupts what we might think of as critical thinking or slow thinking or literacy. If we think about the meme, if we think about that form, then I want you to imagine what is an image soundbite? How do we think about images as a kind of image bite or a sound bite, and how that tends to operate in culture as an explosive device or as powerful precisely because it prevents a lot of engagement on the critical level and yet has a huge impact, a kind of lightning rod. So if you see someone kneeling during the national anthem, or you see a Confederate flag, or you see a monument being torn down, these function in this very important way to maintain sometimes non-critical engagement in the visual environment, and it becomes a kind of war of memes or war of image bites. And as a thinker, I try to understand how that iconoclastic or iconographic process is continuing to work to shape our way of thinking. If you think of images as a discourse, not just a discourse in language, but its own discourse, a set of practices and image-making forms, then you begin to understand that we all have a very deep set of idealects of images in our minds, and these come to bear on what we see and how we see it. So there's been a concerted effort in the production of stereotypes of race and image culture. It's gone on for centuries, at least 500 years. And so the question then becomes, how do we interrupt this? How do we begin to think against this? How do we begin to engage this question? So if we think about what happens with iconoclasm, monuments are torn down, fights take place over whose icons win, and iconoclasm has the potential on the progressive side to undo that which has been done, to uncelebrate a particular hero of the Confederate South, or to uncelebrate a certain figure that needs to be brought down, or a Lenin, for example. Or Buddhists taken out by Iraqis, or, in other words, we have to start, Buddhist sculpture is taken out by, we have to start thinking carefully about iconoclasm as a part of the racial troping of our moment. And so what I'd like to suggest is that there's some really interesting projects that do a kind of strategic iconoclasm, or what I call iconotropism in my book, Subject to Display. Because to iconotrope is to do a spin on it. It's like the lowrider version of thinking. You take something, you change it, but it's still the thing that you kind of had in the first place. And this is what artists do. Artists, critical artists, are really engaged in a lot of practices of racial iconotropism. And I'm just going to give you two examples really quickly from our contemporary moment. We all know that the Islamic Judeo-Christian Bible historically has interpreted Ham as a figure of expulsion. And that interpretation apparently is based on a misreading of the text. Contemporary Hebrew scholars suggest that that's a misreading of the original text. But Hamilton, if you know the musical, is a very interesting example of taking a U.S. story embedding different kinds of racialized bodies in that story, allowing that story to become an American story that's also not the white founding fathers story. But in addition to that, they sell hats, and on the hats it says ham. And it's sort of like, yeah, that's right. So there's a way in which a kind of troping around the device that allowed the southern states in the 19th century to argue for the oppression and subordination of blacks based on this biblical story, probably underlying a lot of current Christian fundamentalism in the United States, I would argue, may have to do with the rise of racism, is still at play. And I think a lot of cultural people recognize that and want to intervene and engage. So that's one kind of iconotropism that I'd say is happening in visual culture. On the other hand, I look at digital culture, and you can now buy skin online. So if you're operating in a artificial world, Second Life or another artificial world, and you want your avatar to look a certain way, I know all of you are doing this all the time. But all of your younger people are. Okay?
There's a lot of people who look like they're in shock here.
All these younger folks are online and they're buying avatars. What's an avatar? It's a graphical representation of you online in your artificial world. You can now spend thousands of dollars buying a skin online. The skin is a graphical depiction of a body that's going to be you. The prettier, the sexier, and the more varieties of color you want for your skin, the more your skin costs. It's a really interesting contemporary moment where race becomes an accessory for a lot of younger folks. They're playing with it. Oh, I think today I'm going to be chocolate, and tomorrow I'm going to be tawny, right? I think today I'm going to have really big ear loops, and then tomorrow... So I'm really intrigued by this contemporary moment where, to me, there's a kind of horrifying lack of notion of history.
But that's another kind of freedom. I mean, one that resonates with the people who are doing this.
Precisely. Yeah. Precisely.
Yeah.
So I would say what's really interesting today is, where are we going to, is this a progressive direction that we're going where you can buy a skin online? Or is that back to property and the properties of people and the idea that, in fact, race is a property, and we know that it's not. It's a relation. So these are things that I'm trying to think through in some of my work.
Interesting. All right. So, Tyler, you have the last question.
Okay.
Last question before we open it up to your questions. So by way of ending our conversation, or at least the stage of it, I wonder whether you could talk about the Statue of Liberty and bring us back to both the United States and France, which, among other things, graces the posters for this event, and talk about its complex and compelling relationship to both freedom and race.
Okay. Well, happy to do that. First of all, I wanted to make a reference to another much more contemporary image of freedom and race. If any of you have ever seen pictures of the House Freedom Caucus, this is a right-wing group of congressmen that have called themselves Embracing Freedom. It's an all-white group, unashamedly all-white. In fact, if you look at their recruiting poster, it has these smiling white faces and a button you can push for donations, right? So lest anybody think this is just a historical meme, it's certainly very much alive and well. I got interested in the Statue of Liberty for several reasons. First of all, because it symbolizes the fact that both France and the United States are not only pride themselves on freedom, but also in many ways wrap their very national identities around the idea that they are free societies, probably more than any other two countries in the world. About 15, 20 years ago, the National Park Service became conscious of the fact that there was this rumor circulating on the internet among African American communities that basically said the first authentic Statue of Liberty was actually black, not white. That the model that you've seen in New York Harbor is actually a fake. And that in fact, some people even went so far as to say the real Statue of Liberty is hidden somewhere in the catacombs of New York. Now, and people even reproduced pictures of the black Statue of Liberty. There actually is a black Statue of Liberty, which is a statue in the French Caribbean island of Saint-Martin. And so there's one image that shows the black Statue of Liberty is the original, the white Statue of Liberty is the fake. Fake news, if I can make that illusion.
Right.
But there were substantive reasons behind this. One argument was the idea that the Statue of Liberty, which is widely seen in the United States as celebrating immigration, was in actual fact not about immigration at all. In actual fact, it was celebrating the fact that the United States had abolished slavery and was at long last the land of the free. Okay. In fact, people also argued that it was intended to celebrate black Union soldiers and celebrate their memory. So less interesting to me was whether this is true or not, because it's obviously not true. At least I don't think there is a black Statue of Liberty somewhere under the 42nd Street station in New York. But what it said about the Statue of Liberty and how both Americans and the French approached the Statue of Liberty. And I just wanted to make a few points about that. First of all, the original model for the Statue of Liberty is really the image of Marianne, the symbol of French nationhood. And probably many of you have seen Eugène Delacroix's famous painting, Liberty Leading the People from 1830, which shows Marianne. Marianne was the mother, in effect, of the Statue of Liberty. But if you look at the two images, they are strikingly different. First of all, Marianne is actually a figure in motion, as opposed to the Statue of Liberty who's standing still. She is also an armed figure, leading an army. She is also bare-breasted. And she is finally, and this became an icon that was really important, she bears what the Romans knew as the Phrygian cap. The Phrygian cap was the cap worn by freed slaves. So it is a symbol of, and here we go back to your question about labor and race, it is a symbol of freedom as being a freed slave. The image of Marianne was reproduced endlessly in France in the 19th century. And in some ways, the most controversial image that arose out of that tradition was during the Paris Commune, the uprising of the Parisian people in 1871, where you had this rumor, and it was actually really just a rumor, that there were these Parisian revolutionary women who were running around the city with firebombs, setting fire to large parts of the city. Nobody ever actually found anybody like this. They actually executed hundreds of women because they thought they were, but there was actually no proof that they ever were. But if you look at the image of for example, the images of they were called the pétroleuses, the female firebombers, the female incendiaries, you see a woman striding, holding a torch. And it doesn't take much to go from there to the Statue of Liberty. But there are some important differences. First of all, as de La Boulaye, the man who came up with the idea of the Statue of Liberty, who was in Paris or near Paris during the Commune, said, my Statue of Liberty will be carrying a torch but not a flame, something to illuminate, not to burn and destroy. So there's a sense in which the Statue of Liberty is a de-radicalized, and also in the French context, a de-racialized image of liberty. And then you get to the United States, and the decision was made, first of all, that the Statue of Liberty would not carry the Phrygian cap. It would have broken chains, but the Statue of Liberty does have broken chains, but they're at its feet. And unless you're in a helicopter, you can't see them because they're hidden by the pedestal. Okay? So any references to slavery, and remember this is being erected in the 1880s, when the memory of slavery was still very fresh, were consciously expunged and excised. Okay? So you have a situation where the Statue of Liberty, which is the greatest symbol of freedom in the United States, bears no relationship whatsoever with what is arguably the greatest freedom struggle in the United States, the struggle against slavery.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you. And now I'd like to open up the floor to questions. Hopefully I can see people. I think there's a microphone that will go around. We have a question here.
Have either of you seen or all three of you seen the movie Get Out?
No, but I really, really want to. I have a hard time with horror movies, but this one's the one I'm going to see.
It's not a horror movie.
Okay.
In that sense.
Right.
And I would be interested
It is a horror
in your
movie.
reactions that if you have seen the movie, you might have to go maybe.
I haven't seen the.
I know, I'm embarrassed I haven't seen it yet.
I haven't seen the movie because my son is at an age where he wouldn't be caught dead in the same theater with me. So either I go at another time or wait for it to come out on video. So.
Well, that's too bad. That's my question in.
Okay.
Sorry.
I did see an interview with the filmmaker and some clips of the movie, and that's what made me want to see it. I was particularly impressed with his articulation of how race impedes and informs all kinds of relations on the personal level, and how to live this is really a daily horror. And that was really very compelling. Yeah. There's a question.
We have one over here.
We need the microphone, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I really have two questions. One is more historical. Do you think that the Missouri Compromise was a way of recognizing 2 points of view, or was it just a way of taking race off the table so that the country could move forward? My other question is, do you think 23andMe and places like that are going to change our viewpoint of race?
That's a great question.
You want to tackle the? You tackle the 23.
You do the Missouri Compromise?
Okay.
Okay. We're different kinds of historians. In a previous iteration of preparing for this, I thought about the 23andMe, and I was going to say something about it. I have to confess that when I think about 23andMe, and I know friends who've done this, it to me smacks of a kind of eugenicist pseudoscience. You know, it's sort of about, it's the fantasy that we can locate truth in this sort of magical form of the genetic thread, when in fact we know there's no gene for race. We know that there are certain genes that indicate maybe hair type or skin color, but is that a race? In fact, what's really interesting about race is that we have all these words that don't make sense together. Black, white, brown are colors, and then we have African, Asian, Latino, which are vague, you know, pointers toward geographical regions and forms of linguistic, you know, it's completely fascinating to me that race is the very thing that we cannot pin down, the very thing that shapes daily life, that we'd prefer not to have to deal with, but that nevertheless we have to work on. And it's just a fascinating, it's so useful precisely because you can't pin it down. So here's the 23andMe, my thinking. I'm thinking, okay, on the positive side, people notice that they're really mixed, and that could be a nice outcome. That the fact, because we all are, like it or not, that's just a fact. What the mix is, you know, where it comes from, all of those things might be interesting. Okay, but frankly, on the negative side, thousands of people voluntarily lining up and giving out statistical information about their racial heritage to large data banks that could then be used in ways that we know they've been used in the past. Whoa. Okay, so I'm a historian, so I see it in a little different light. Okay, that's my take.
Okay. And with regard to your other question about the Missouri Compromise, first of all, let me state that I'm not primarily an American historian. There are people in the audience that are probably more qualified to answer this question than me, but they're there and I'm here, so I'll take a shot at it. It is part of this whole narrative of saying that a nation cannot exist half slave and half free, which is a classic trope in American history. And I think what part of what I'm arguing is that, in effect, freedom has no meaning without slavery. And that was the other side of the Missouri Compromise. That we define ourselves against what we are not, against something that we are not, as well as what we are. And this, I think, is an important sort of thing to think about when it comes to contemporary ideas about freedom, okay? So if we say that we're free, are we also saying that somebody else is not free? And what does it mean? Can we all be, can this be like Lake Wobegon country? Can we all be better than average? Can we all be freer than average? Or do we have other ideas about people that are not?
Right, and it gets mobilized like in the war in Iraq. I mean, that
Right.
was an argument that was made is that to free the Iraqis.
Right.
And to bring liberal democracy. So,
And if I may just jump in
Yeah.
here, it seems to me that in her book, Abolition Democracy, Angela Davis also really clearly articulates how basically the switch from slavery to criminalization is practically just an overnight
Right.
process.
Right. Right, and in fact, a pretty seamless one oftentimes, yeah.
And we certainly have that condition with the prison industrial complex today, yeah.
Anna.
So, yeah, Anna, yeah. Is there a microphone? Yeah.
I think this is a good question to ask after what you said, Tyler. As an economist, I've been thinking about a more general sort of relationship between freedom and race, because a lot of what has been sort of talked about here does not refer to does not apply to the kinds of problems that the analogs that I can see in a country like India. So as an economist, we have this concept of the capabilities approach, which is that freedom is the opportunity to live the kind of life that you have reason to value, to have the kinds of functionings that you have, so that you don't need the other. You're basically looking at the economic opportunities, and therefore racial discrimination can be defined in terms of not having that freedom. So it's the other is really the circumstances, the social, the economic circumstances.
Right.
And so, I mean, I'm thinking about a more general relationship or a more way of defining this, the issues that you have been framing in the context of the Americas or in more Western sort of terms.
Right.
So that's my question is whether that's a way that you would also alternatively think about these issues.
Yeah. Thank you for that comment. I was thinking before, why don't we think about freedom from things, right? Freedom from hunger, freedom from racism, right? So there's a way that the state will set up a notion of the free individual, going back to that question of autonomy, as a kind of object that is non-defined, but will not actually talk about, well, what are the conditions that we might want to be free from, want, hunger, etc., or freedom to do, such as be creative and so forth. So I think coming back to your comment, it's helpful to expand our notions about how freedom can apply to different communities and their possibilities of expression, creation, embetterment.
It would include everything. It would almost be an inclusive thing that would include the kinds of things that you have been talking about in specific cases and specific circumstances.
Yeah, that's great.
Let me also answer that very briefly. During the Second World War, there was a very popular conception of a kind of positive freedom in the United States. It was immortalized in, as Norman Rockwell's painting, The Four Freedoms, which talked about the freedom to, and it showed a painting of a family at Thanksgiving, of the freedom to consume freely, the freedom to be well-fed, or to be fed, for that matter, at that point. This is shortly after the Depression. So there are times in which there is a kind of positive freedom for, a conception of freedom as well. And there has often been a debate among both intellectuals and I would say also religious figures that rejects the idea of freedom as simply license. Because that's one of the things that really interests me, that the sort of negative image of freedom as a negative quality, license, anarchy, lack of law, so on and so forth, and the way that that's also racialized. But people will argue that the ultimate freedom is the freedom to realize one's potential as a human being. You know, that's right. So that's a very different kind of vision of freedom. I think American popular culture tends not to emphasize that so much, as opposed to somebody like Nietzsche, for example, for whom that was his vision of freedom. But part of it is one is more commercial and one is less, I think.
That's
so.
right.
Of course, it can trace back to Adam Smith and
Right.
the Nussbaum then,
Free market.
Marcus
Right.
and so.
Yeah.
I think we have a question back there. Yes. This, right, back row. Okay. This person, yes.
I'm not sure, thank you for the conversation. I'm not sure if that would make sense, but I was thinking how does race itself influences the conversation of race? Like, how does race itself influences the conversation of race?
That is, yeah, rape.
Race.
Race.
Yeah.
Yep. With a P, or how do you spell it?
Race.
How does race influence the conversation?
Race?
Yeah.
How does race influence the conversation around race?
Yeah, just
so.
race. The race itself how does that race influences the conversation of race itself? I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it makes sense. Why don't you say what you think? Because I think you have an idea that will make sense.
Because when I saw the subject, right, freedom and race, I was expecting more about how racism and race itself is basically benefiting a specific group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, as a brown man, I was thinking probably they're going to talk about how racism is still benefiting, a very exclusive second society, and how people are still really against it, but they're still benefiting from it.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind
Yes.
of
Okay.
so that was
Yes,
my question.
yes, I understand.
Okay.
Understand the question.
Okay.
Sure, it's a great question. This very conversation, right, is kind of overdetermined by the fact that people had to pay and who has economic privilege. I mean, we need to think about this, I think, all the time. In fact, before we came out, we were talking about maybe we should do another one that's free for a bigger community. So just thinking about thinking about these questions, I think, is very
There's
important.
that free word again, by the way. It's,
And I think, yeah, it's free. So I think it affects the platforms that people are allowed to have. I think it affects who the speakers are that are taken seriously in mainstream culture. I was thinking about the fact that recently David Letterman had a conversation with President Obama where he said similar things about race, as we've been saying on the stage here today, but that, it was David Letterman was the one who was in the position to ask the questions. And I was just thinking about how in the United States we are free to speak, but we're not necessarily allowed to be heard. And I think that if you think about the way the mass media works, or the way newspapers work, or the way other kinds of, as we know, corporate-owned forms of communication work, we know that race is a central component, or racism, not race so much as racism and a certain, let's call it commercial agenda, is what drives possibilities for enunciation. And absolutely, who are we hearing from? Who are we constantly hearing from? Who are we not hearing from? Who are we not being able to hear? I think that is a critical component of our contemporary moment, which is why all of you should be extremely upset about the efforts to commercialize and privatize the internet. Yes. Because right now, it's one of the few places where we still can have independent media that's accessible to many, not all. And I think we need to be extremely virulent in our protection of that communication space, because I'm concerned that once that happens, we're way back to a long time ago in terms of that. So anyway.
okay. Let me respond also very briefly. I think your question reminds me of a question I've often gotten, which is how can you call freedom racist when peoples of color are often mobilized behind the banner of freedom in terms of their own popular struggles? If you think about the civil rights movement and struggle for freedom now, for example, if you think about all the many times the desire for freedom has been mobilized from slaves to ex-slaves, so on and so forth, all the way up to the present, how can you say that freedom is also racially determined? And my response to that is that there's truth on both sides. I mean, for example, the reason the Statue of Liberty became a symbol of immigrants was largely due to the immigrants themselves, or rather, more precisely, to their Americanized children, who were able to claim that as their own space and as a symbol of what they wanted to do. So I think there's this constant dialogue between the idea of freedom as something that excludes people of color and it's something that's therefore claimed by people of color.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, Adrian.
Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
But maybe other people can't.
Yeah.
There you go.
Thank you. So around 2008 or so, a little bit after the election of President Obama, there was certainly a lot of talk that we have perhaps moved to a post-racial society. Now, I think we know that we're not there, but I'm curious to know what your thoughts are of people about that idea, and for those who were claiming that we were at that point by the election of President Obama, what do you think what that was meant to articulate for them by expressing that we had suddenly moved beyond the impacts of race?
Well, I think two things, and sort of following up on my early response. It meant, first of all, a hope that we truly were in a post-racial era. I mean, if you remember the explosion of joy that happened in November 2008 when Obama was elected, it wasn't just because people thought Obama was a nice guy. It was that this symbolized a whole new era in American society. The other response is, well, you finally got a black person in the White House, so we don't have to talk about this stuff anymore, right? And there was that side of it too. And I wouldn't even say that the two were sort of distinct, mutually separate. They were sort of interacted in very interesting kind of ways. And there were other things about that historical moment. For example, the fact that Obama followed upon seemingly endless period of Republican rule by a Republican president whose own election was sort of, shall we say, challenging in terms of its legitimacy. Also the fact that Obama was mixed race, and he represented a whole new presence of mixed race people in American society that had not, until that point, been so salient. So I think it represented a lot of things, yeah.
Yeah. In some of my other writing, I try to address the fact that the internet is often touted as a race-free zone or a racially neutral space because people can't see your body online, so you are not necessarily going to be a victim of racial attacks, for example. And I argue in my writing that that's just not true, that everyone brings with them a very complex history of race relations, that we inherit a lot of stereotypes, and we're engaged constantly in trying to mitigate the real world and its interface with those stereotypes. And so I think it's really a complicated question that you're posing, because on the one hand, I would be delighted if everyone could give it up, right? Let's give up that idea altogether because we invented it. We should be able to get rid of it, right? But we are living in a culture where, for example, it matters on the census what you mark, because it might determine not only funding in certain ways for certain areas, but public and political representation. So how do we simultaneously give up racism, give up the very concept of race, while recognizing that we still live in an incredibly stratified, incredibly racially segregated, deeply hierarchical society? And I think that is the balance we have to kind of keep working with as we go forward.
All right, well, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Tyler, and thank you.
Thank you.